Ramzan Kadyrov heads Russia's Republic of Chechnya. How did he come to power there? What role does he play in Russian politics? And is he independent of Moscow? Answering those questions are OSW's experts Maria Domańska and Wojciech Górecki. Kadyrov was born in 1976. He's been a force to reckon with in Chechnya, the Caucasus, and the whole of Russia for 20 years. His career is linked to his father, Akhmad Kadyrov, who was a mufti, a religious leader, and also one of the leaders of the Chechen combatants during the First Chechen War, from 1994 to 1996.
Ramzan Kadyrov stał wówczas u jego boku.
Ramzan Kadyrov was at his side then. Later, in 1996, after victory in the First Chechen War, he was also close to his father. At this time, the Salafists, radical Muslims, gained more influence in the Republic, inspired by radical Islam from outside Russia. Akhmad Kadyrov, in his role as a mufti and a supporter of the Islam traditional for the Caucasus, for Chechnya, so based on Sufism and mysticism in Islam, and his main opponents here were not Russian politicians, not Russia, but precisely these Salafis, radical Islamists with whom the traditional Muslims were starting to lose the war for the faithful. This was why Kadyrov changed the front when the Second Chechen War broke out in 1999 and switched to the Russian side. He was hoping that, with Russian support, he would simply eliminate these radical Muslims. This is obviously simplifying the issue, but that was Akhmad Kadyrov's general calculation, and his son Ramzan's, who was then the head of his personal bodyguard. After the war in 2002, Russia knew that it could subdue Chechnya, but that it didn't have the means or the strength to control it. This saw the emergence of the idea of Chechenization, which would see control handed to a trusted person. In this case, that meant Akhmad Kadyrov. But the new Chechen leader would be assassinated shortly after taking power on the 9th of May 2004. His son Ramzan took over.
Akhmad Kadyrov ушел из жизни 9 мая, в день нашего общенационального праздника, в День Победы. И ушел непобежденным.
Początkowo nie mógł formalnie zostać.
At first, he couldn't become the formal leader of the Republic because he was under 30 years old. But he began to de facto take control, and he gradually also took over functions. He started as the deputy prime minister and later the president of Chechnya. And he also continued his father's policy of inviting those fighters who decided to lay down their arms to join him, his departments. He also legitimized himself, referring to Islam, of course to traditional Islam. He took good care of places of worship of, for example, Kunta Haji, a Chechen leader during the war with Russia. We could call him the Caucasus Gandhi or St. Francis. Kadyrov, on the other hand, would make his name as an authoritarian leader, breaching human rights. He started his rule by intensively cracking down on the opposition.
Eliminował środowiska.
He eliminated groups of Chechens loyal to Moscow. Not only the Kadyrovs were loyal, there were also the Yamadayevs from Gudermes. And around 2008, after the Russian-Georgian War, he succeeded in eliminating the Yamadayev clan from politics. And in the early 2010s, we could say he'd achieved full power, full control over the Republic, while also gaining a very high level of independence from Moscow, and also achieving the position we're talking about, meaning being someone much, much more important than a mere leader of one of the constituent republics of the Russian Federation.
Just as Chechnya is no ordinary region of the Russian Federation, Ramzan Kadyrov is no ordinary regional leader. He's not a typical governor. In the Russian system, a governor is really a middle manager who is entirely dependent on the Kremlin for budget transfers, on decision makers who operate outside their region and decide about the region from the outside. But Ramzan Kadyrov has made himself into the owner of Chechnya and has created a despotic regime there. Kadyrov suggests that he has sovereign power in Chechnya, that he's a padishah, and is even becoming a despotic leader, the Sultan of Chechnya.
Kadyrov ma bardzo
Kadyrov is very ambitious, and some of these ambitions took hold when he gained control of the whole republic. He wanted to move beyond Chechnya in the physical and symbolic sense. There were attempts to take over, and these were partly successful, some bordering regions of the neighboring republics of Ingushetia and also Dagestan. Here we can describe his methods as releasing test balloons. A Chechen division would capture a village on the Ingushetia side, or the Chechen government, the Chechen parliament, would declare that the border was being revised, and they'd wait and see what happened, how big the resistance was. Would Moscow intervene or not? We should say that at a certain point, Moscow did in fact decide to curtail these ambitions, and since then Kadyrov has not so openly been demanding territorial cessions for Chechnya, though he does speak out on behalf of Chechens, and not only for Chechen Muslims, but for the entire Caucasus, for all Russia's Muslims, for all the world's Muslims. In this symbolic way, he's widening the scope of his activity and emphasizing his position. More than once he's caused problems with this, for example when he spoke out in defense of the Rohingya Muslim minority in Burma, in Myanmar. He was behind a very large demonstration in Moscow in defense of this minority, and it forced the Russian Federation to modify its foreign policy. And this shows Kadyrov's influence, what possibilities he has. Another colourful example, a rather interesting one, was a multi-stage competition in Russia to choose a building to be a symbol of the Russian Federation. For a very long time, the conquest was led by the Heart of Chechnya Mosque in Grozny. It's a huge mosque for 10,000 worshippers, with minarets over 60 meters tall. There were some leaks that Chechen civil servants were tasked with sending text messages for several hours a day to vote for precisely this building to represent the Russian Federation. It's still not clear whether Kadyrov is an independent player or Putin's puppet.
Kadyrov's attitude to Russia, which Chechnya is still formally a part of, is very unusual. He frequently stresses that he's loyal to President Putin, but he openly undermines the right of Russian Federation bodies to interfere in internal Chechen affairs. Chechnya and the Russian Federation are joined by a kind of personal union, meaning Kadyrov's personal loyalty. His behavior towards Putin is like a feudal contract between a lord and a vassal. We can infer from this that if Putin ever leaves power, then his successor will need to renegotiate this feudal contract with Kadyrov. Chechnya is fairly often called the internal abroad in the Russian Federation. This is a paradoxical term meant to reflect the actual situation there. The law of the Russian Federation is not, in principle, applied on Chechen territory. Federal bodies don't have access there. But if they do dare to interfere in internal Chechen affairs, then Kadyrov very often publicly expresses his outrage. A few years ago, some police officers were pursuing a criminal and went to Chechnya without Kadyrov's knowledge or consent. Kadyrov stated that no one is going to interfere in Chechen affairs, that he prohibits this, and that the next time it happens, they will open fire on these people without giving warning if they dare undermine his exclusive and sovereign power in the area. Practically speaking, Russian laws do not function on Chechen territory. Kadyrov has introduced his own order there, and it's based on lawlessness. Declaratively, also on Sharia law, which covers over this lawlessness and provides excuse for it. Kadyrov regularly organizes demonstrations of his strength. For example, he brought 1,000 trained fighters, officers of the enforcement structures, to a stadium in Grozny and declared that they are at the disposal of President Putin and that he too is Putin's soldier. The last demonstration of this kind took place after the war broke out in Ukraine. Kadyrov declared that his Chechens will defend Russia's interests in Ukraine. But these demonstrations of strength, considering that Kadyrov only declares his loyalty to Putin and not to Russia, are quite ambivalent. I mean that on the one hand, yes, he demonstrably shows his loyalty and states that he'll carry out any order Russia gives. But on the other hand, he's baring his teeth. It's a kind of warning for the Russian elite that if he doesn't like something, if it's not in his interest, then these well-armed and well-trained people may turn against Russia, though of course never against Putin himself. So is Kadyrov a puppet or an independent player? I don't think he's an independent player. He's more like a tool of the Kremlin. He's not completely a puppet, because although he does move within the parameters which the Kremlin and Putin have set for him, he does have a lot of room for maneuver and freedom of movement when it concerns the repressions he carries out on Chechens themselves. But Kadyrov's long arm has reached outside Chechnya and into other Russian regions on several occasions. The Yangulbayev affair was a big story, and it clearly shows what the Chechen regime is like and what its relation to the Putin regime is.
Abu Bakr Yangulbayev worked in the Russian Committee Against Torture and drew attention to the many cases of torture and political murders in Chechnya, which brought his entire family into conflict with Kadyrov. In 2015, the family was forced to leave Chechnya. In January 2022, Chechen Siloviks forced entry into Judge Yangulbayev's home in Nizhny Novgorod and abducted his wife.
Zarema
Musayeva was abducted from her home in Nizhny Novgorod. She was taken to Grozny and became a hostage of the regime. They wanted her sons to surrender themselves to Kadyrov, but that didn't happen, and she's still being detained. They accused her of assaulting a police officer. After being taken to Grozny, the judge and his daughter left Russia. Both sons have long been outside the Russian Federation. What was very telling in this kidnapping was that it was an attack on the home of a judge who has immunity, and yet local officers from the FSB and the police took part in these actions, and no intervention from the law enforcement agency was effective. This means that local Siloviks were accomplices to this crime. Later on, the Kremlin failed to take a position, and the same with the prosecution. They all kept quiet.
Kadyrov, along with his close associate Adam Demilkhanov, publicly threatened to kill Yangulbayev's family if they dared criticize Kadyrov. Kadyrov said the family belongs in jail or underground, but Demilkhanov said they should be beheaded.
And even though Demilkhanov has been a member of parliament for many years, even this was not enough for the State Duma Ethics Committee to react. Nor did the prosecutor, nor did the police, and nor did the FSB.
The Kremlin tolerates Kadyrov's actions because he's an important part of the system. His main task is to maintain order in the North Caucasus.
What we have is a situation where, if anyone is brave enough to criticize Putin, the Kremlin, the Russian political regime, then they know that the maximum punishment will probably be prison. There are extreme examples of murders or attempted murders of opposition figures, such as Navalny, Vladimir Karamurza, and others. But we can say that the default is rather prison. But if you get into trouble with Kadyrov, then your life is at risk. Yelena Milashina is a journalist at Novaya Gazeta, a very brave woman who's been working on Chechnya for many years and who isn't easily startled. When Kadyrov started to threaten her, she decided to leave Russia, fearing for her life. This role of Kadyrov as a boogeyman is partly successful. I mean that you can find many people in Russia who are anti-Putin or anti-Kremlin, anti-regime, but they say that Putin is protecting Russia from Kadyrov, as if Kadyrov wasn't created by Putin, but was some kind of independent player who Putin has to struggle to contain. In reality, it seems that Kadyrov needs to be more scared of Putin than vice versa, and that Putin is treating Kadyrov as a necessary evil, someone who occasionally causes problems, but whose main function at the moment is ensuring peace in the North Caucasus.
And what do people think about Kadyrov in Russia?
The last poll on Kadyrov from the independent Levada Center was from 2017. Respondents mostly had a positive view of Kadyrov. They feel that he stabilized Chechnya, took it under his control. But it's also interesting that around half the respondents said that they feel that Kadyrov can be trusted. This seems odd, as if Kadyrov was somehow a foreign body when it comes to Russia's predominant ethnos, culture, religion, lifestyle, and idea of social order. For me, this just shows that people don't know much about Kadyrov and the system he's created in Chechnya. Kadyrov rather functions on the edge of social awareness. There is social awareness that Kadyrov is at the service of the Russian Federation, that he's performing important functions, for example, in sending his fighters to Ukraine. The Russian elite treats Kadyrov as their own man in the system. Very many of the elite are critical of Kadyrov, including in the enforcement structures, whom Kadyrov denies competences and rights to engage in Chechen affairs. But their attempts to interfere always fail, because the Kremlin is apparently protecting Kadyrov and protecting the people who break the law while following his orders. There are signs of this in at least a few cases of well-known political assassinations. Natalia Stemirova, Anna Politkovskaya, Boris Nemtsov. The clues lead to Chechnya, directly to the people around Kadyrov. Of course, no one ever proved anything outright, but we can assume with high probability that he gave the orders in at least some of these murders.
To, co trzyma Kadyrowa przy Moskwie,
Besides his loyalty to Putin, which I don't doubt is sincere, it's money that keeps Kadyrov with Moscow. This money helped rebuild Grozny, and he rebuilt his position. I'm able to imagine a situation wherein Putin leaves and the money dries up, and so Kadyrov stops being loyal towards the Kremlin's new resident and causes more and more problems. Because although Ramzan Kadyrov, just like other Chechen leaders, goes arm in arm with Moscow and is at the forefront of Moscow's politics, in fact I wouldn't say he's a pro-Russian politician. He's a pro-Chechen politician. Of course, Chechnya's interests are in line with his own. He sees it in his own way. But I'm convinced that whatever he does, he feels he's doing it for Chechnya. Besides his emotional link to Putin, what links him to Moscow is not very emotional. What he wants is to go down in history as the leader of his nation. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this film, you might like the one you can see on screen now.